So I did a really quick little pencil tracing of that sketch so that we can do some marker on top of it. Okay, so we have this tracing paper quick sketch based on a uniform design, a really quick little pencil drawing that I showed you from my notebook. Also, what you can see here on the left are some quick marker sample swatches. So marker, unlike paint or drawing on your tablet, right, is harder to mix and correct color on the fly. So marker dries really quickly. And it's basically a true pigment in there. These are, I'm going to show you using both alcohol-based markers, like these are some Prismacolors, actually the yellow, blue, and kind of dark blue teal that you see there are right here. So like all paint and dye, they're darker when they're wet and they become lighter when they dry, right? But marker dries quickly. So the marker stroke, brush stroke, pen stroke, whatever you want to call it, is much more visible and prominent because at the minute you put it down, I'm going to show you a darker teal that I haven't sampled yet, that stroke seals. So I'll do another kind of little squiggle thing over here. This is a brush tip, right? So in terms of like replicating something like a paintbrush, these are great because pressure dictates the thickness. Because I'm working on tracing paper, the marker is bleeding out a little bit at the edges after I first put it down, the way that paint might, but because it dries so quickly, right, it very quickly kind of finds its shape and stays. The last little edit got cut off right before, I think I didn't have the chance to explain cool versus warm grays. I know that in the watercolor section, I talked about the nature of shadows being on the cool side, but markers, the cool versus warm discussion is much more clear. So markers are actually separated by cool grays and warm grays. Cool grays are the shadow colors, right? A warm gray is actually a pretty good flesh tone, kind of mid-tone modeling gray. But if you want something that looks more like the actual valleys and recesses that cloth creates, and the shadows that would go into them, cools are the ones you want. So I'm going to pull these a little closer so you can see the numbers. Right here I have a 9, an 8, and a 7. That refers to percentage. So a 9 is like 90% gray, meaning it's almost black, right? Like 100% would be black. 8 is 80%, 7 is 70%, and so on. They really go down to 20%. 10% is the lowest that these grayscale colors can go, and that is almost invisible. So a full range would let you do really realistic and subtle modeling and shadowing. I went with 60% Prismacolor, which is that swatch there. It's a pretty new one, so it's pretty saturated with pigment. Some of the swatches you can see here are from older ones, so that top one right there is actually an 80% Prismacolor, but it's probably 10 years old, right? So with markers, it's really important to test your tips regularly and see where they're at. You know, even when one is sort of faded or gives you kind of a dry brush quality, it's still perfectly usable. So there's no reason to get rid of them until they're completely devoid of pigment. Unfortunately, you didn't see me do this whole process of basically underpainting the shadows. So this is all with a 60% brush tip Prismacolor, which again lets me control the thickness and thinness, right? So it gives a bit of a painterly quality. So in this, because the dress was made out of a stretch poly cotton that was fairly thick, right? There's not a lot of fine drapery or small wrinkles and folds. There's pretty architectural form that hugs the body. So most of the shadows that I'm going to go ahead, that I gestured in, are related to just describing the form as it rolls away from the light source, which is coming from here. And so Actually, the legs were laid in later and more recently. They're not completely dry, so they're also darker because they're still wet, versus these shadows up here that have already dried and are probably at their final coloration. And so, right, I'm hitting points that are rolling away from the light source, that are ultimately going to be softened under whatever color I put over it, as well as overlap points where there are hard shadows where cloth meets skin, or overlaps onto legs and so on. I'm actually going to go ahead and roll this one out a little bit further over the leg to match what I've done here, and put this leg that's behind further into shadow. It wouldn't really get that much light onto it with the amount of shadow that I've put onto the dress here. I'm going to go ahead and extend that shadow over and roll this shadow up as well. I think one mistake and thing that I want to advise you not to do is to like overly shadow and define the bust. Like A, it's distracting, and B, it's not really realistic. That's like a cartoon kind of comic thing. So right, in reality, most garments kind of round these things out and are meant to kind of smooth the body and the form. So I'm gonna bring that over a little bit more, and that kind of matches with that. And I'm gonna go ahead and let some of the facial shadows also show that kind of dramatic side light. I'm gonna leave her there. And let's go ahead. I'm gonna go ahead and use this top one. I think this was actually, it looks really peachy, but this is brick beige. I'm gonna use that to lay in an overall skin tone just throughout. The marker you're gonna see on the tracing paper is less stable than it would be on paper. On paper, it would not really lift up much at all. But on tracing paper, it's kind of mobile, right? So if you can see, it actually kind of blends it up. You don't want to overwork marker. That's really, really important, because the more you kind of work it and blend it, the worse it looks. I'm gonna mix these two blues together. So I think I had used that blue swatch right there is this Mediterranean blue. It's quite pretty. I'm gonna use the broad tip. And I'm going to use this to lay down basically a mid-tone. I like to largely leave some of the white of the paper for implied highlight. So I try to do that. I think it also makes it feel a little bit more fresh. Depends though. If we want to make this look like it's a really kind of saturated blue, I don't want to do too much of that because it'll start to look like it's kind of pastel. So I'm going to switch to the finer tip now to get into those smaller spaces. So these chisel tip markers, right? You get a flat broad tip that you saw me fill in the whole dress, and then you can use the chisel tip for a smaller. The color builds up, so the parts that I went over more than once, it gets deeper and darker and more saturated. And that plus the underpainting, right, has a lot of mottled shadow. I don't know who has teal shoes. Nobody that I know, but she does. Kind of 80s. Once it's a little bit drier, with the skin, will probably go in with a colorless blender. This right here is a colorless blender. So this is something that, again, it has the different tips, like a finer tip, and it has a brush tip. So this does two things. I can use this, like if I had a hard dry line and I wanted to soften it and blend it out, like let's take a look at this yellow right now. I can use it both to kind of stretch and extend. I could use it to blend two colors together, right? But it also kind of works like an eraser too. It's basically just alcohol. Right, so this is, in marker land, this is the closest you're gonna get to an eraser, or basically like a blending brush. Well, here, let's do a little example. I can carve out a little bit more highlight on the leg areas. So it's kind of like I've gone in with maybe white or something like that. You don't wanna overdo it though. And then of course, remember it's a blender, so if you go into too many different areas, you're going to start to blend colors together that you might not want to. It's always better to, if you're creating a color, to find a couple different tones to create that color rather than just one. I mean, skin and everything kind of works in the same way, where using multiple different colors and tones creates a more realistic and interesting depiction. So I'm going to use a different kind of marker. This is a Tombow brush tip water-based marker. So these actually work even more like watercolor. These actually work on top of watercolor quite brilliantly. This would be a woman who's like dyed her hair some sort of a burgundy, I guess. Not a natural hair color. Okay, so now we are going to just add in some quick illustration lines and accent lines with a black felt tip marker. So we're going to use a micron. I'm actually going to use this 8 instead of the brush tip on this one because it's small. So I don't want, the brush tip might be a little too unwieldy for something in this scale. So if I had something a little bit finer, that would actually be better. I kind of took that line in a little too far. So this is a place where the far sides of things, as well as directional hairlines, can be put in quite quickly. It's also a way to kind of bring back some of the pencil-based drawing that maybe got lost. I'm going to hit the parts basically where I had cast shadows or hard shadows, and particularly the places where things like overlap and meet. Right, as well as the edges that go away from things. By putting in that little bit of black, we gave her a little bit of pop, right? And so it was just hitting overlap points, cast shadow points, and some major kind of recession and receding areas, right? You could go farther, so this wouldn't normally be my go-to, but if you wanted to do some kind of really quick and suggestive kind of cross-hatching, you can do that kind of thing as well, right? It starts to be a little more overtly cartoony when you get into that area, so, and again, you have to question, like, how much time do I really need to spend doing this? My preferred highlight of choice is definitely more of a white colored pencil because it's kind of grabby and chalky, but I don't have my full kit here, so I'm going to use a jelly pen. Not my favorite. I do understand that they're very popular, so I'm going to hit some of these points with that. If you want to give it a little extra dimension, right, we can do something like that. So there is a very quick marker sketch